Imagine the Roman Empire at its height, unstoppable armies, glittering palaces, and emperors who ruled the known world. But behind the marble walls and golden triumphs, whispers turned to rumors, and rumors into scandals so dangerous they shook the empire's very foundations. Betrayals in the palace, corruption in the Senate, and secrets that could destroy emperors overnight. These were not just moments of shame, they were ticking time bombs. This is the scandalous story of power, betrayal, and the empire that almost fell. Picture Rome in the 1st century AD, the marble capital of a world-spanning empire. The Colosseum hadn't yet risen, but the city was already a monument to power, with its gleaming temples, sprawling forums, and roads that stretched to the edges of the known world. Citizens gathered in the Circus Maximus to cheer chariot races. Senators debated policy under painted ceilings, and the emperor the princeps reigned with an aura of divine authority. But behind the golden marble, the air inside the imperial palace was heavy, not with incense, but with fear. Here, the empire's greatest threats were not legions at the borders or rebellions in the provinces. They were family dinners that turned to poison, whispered accusations in marble corridors, and the silent glances of guards whose loyalty could be bought. The Julio-Claudian dynasty, heirs to Augustus himself, was the first imperial family. To the public, they embodied Rome's order and stability. Privately, they were locked in a cycle of suspicion, betrayal, and ambition that would leave a trail of blood across generations. It began with Tiberius, Augustus's reluctant successor. Tiberius had been a competent general, expanding Rome's borders in Germania and the Balkans. But as emperor, he withdrew from public life. By 26 AD, he abandoned Rome for the island of Capri. The official reason was health and rest. Rumors whispered otherwise. Ancient accounts painted Capri as a place of indulgence and paranoia, a fortress where Tiberius surrounded himself with astrologers, informers, and a network of spies who carried out quiet executions in his name. With the emperor absent, power fell into the hands of Lucius Aelius Sejanus, commander of the Praetorian Guard. Sejanus was ambitious, cunning, and ruthless. He restructured the Guard, concentrating them in a single fortified camp near Rome, turning them from ceremonial protectors into a political force. One by one, rivals were eliminated, senators accused of treason, generals dismissed or exiled, and even members of the imperial family sidelined or executed. For nearly a decade, Sejanus ruled in all but name. Some historians believe he planned to marry into the imperial line and take the throne himself. But in 31 AD, Tiberius struck back. Letters arrived in the Senate, revealing charges of treason against Sejanus. The man who had seemed untouchable was dragged from his seat, executed, and his body thrown to the mob. In a single day, his allies scattered, and Rome learned how close it had come to being ruled by a palace usurper. The lesson should have been clear, but history doesn't often repeat itself neatly. It mutates. 2 decades later, Emperor Claudius sat on the throne. Awkward in speech and gait, Claudius had been underestimated his entire life, dismissed as a harmless scholar. Yet he proved an effective ruler, expanding into Britannia and reforming the legal system. But in his personal life, he was less cautious. His marriage to Agrippina the Younger, his niece, was more than scandalous by Roman standards. It was a political alliance with one of the most dangerous women in Roman history. Agrippina was ambitious beyond measure. She maneuvered her son from a previous marriage, Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, later known as Nero, into the line of succession. Ancient historians, many hostile to her, claim she poisoned Claudius with a dish of mushrooms, clearing the path for her son to rule. Whether or not the tale is true, Claudius's sudden death in 54 AD was convenient for her cause. Under Nero, the imperial palace became both a theater and a battlefield. Nero craved admiration, performing as a musician and actor roles unbecoming of an emperor in Roman eyes. Scandal followed him like a shadow. In 59 AD, he ordered the murder of his own mother, Agrippina, after their relationship soured into suspicion and open hostility. The Senate praised him, but whispers spread in the streets, if an emperor could kill his own mother, who was safe? Then came the Great Fire of Rome in 64 AD. For 6 days, flames devoured the city. 10 of Rome's 14 districts suffered damage, 3 were reduced to ashes. In the chaos, rumors ignited that Nero himself had ordered the fire to clear land for a new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Ancient writers disagree on the truth, but the perception was enough to damage Nero's reign permanently. To shift blame, he accused Rome's small Christian community, unleashing brutal persecutions. By 68 AD, rebellion flared in the provinces. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Facing capture, Nero took his own life, reportedly lamenting, "What an artist dies in me." His death ended the Julio-Claudian line, but the scandals of that dynasty had already reshaped the imperial image. No longer was the emperor an untouchable figure of unity, he was a mortal man, vulnerable to plots and capable of monstrous acts. Yet the palace was only one pillar of Rome's power, and as its foundation shook, another, the army, would prove just as unstable. The Roman army was never solely a military force. It served as the empire's core, the structured mechanism that constructed roads through mountains, erected bridges over rivers, and carried Roman law, language, and governance across vast territories. Wherever the legions advanced, they established the imprint of Rome: stone fortifications, thriving settlements, and the conviction that the empire's influence was enduring. Its discipline and organization were highly regarded across the ancient world. Legionaries trained continuously, practiced formation drills until their movements were perfectly synchronized, and swore an oath, the sacramentum, committing them to follow their commander's directives and serve the state with full dedication. By the 3rd century AD, however, the nature of this oath began to change. It still existed, but its interpretation had shifted. The legions no longer pledged unwavering allegiance to the Senate or to the abstract concept of Rome. Instead, their loyalty became directed toward individuals, often those who could provide them with substantial monetary rewards, favorable conditions, and security. The army that had once contributed to the empire's expansion now played a role in its destabilization. The origins of this transformation lay in earlier centuries. As the empire expanded, rulers understood that maintaining the satisfaction of the legions was as critical as securing military victories. A successful general could emerge as a political contender, and a dissatisfied army could influence imperial succession. Soldiers became aware of their strategic importance, realizing that no ruler could govern effectively without their support, and they began to set terms for that support. This reality became evident in 235 AD with the death of Emperor Severus Alexander. He had attempted to negotiate peace with the Germanic tribes along the Rhine frontier. His troops perceived this approach as ineffective. In a sudden act, they removed him from power, resulting in the deaths of both the emperor and his mother. His removal initiated what historians now refer to as the crisis of the 3rd century, a prolonged period of instability lasting around 50 years, during which more than 20 emperors rose and fell, most meeting violent ends. The cycle was repetitive. A general would secure a victory, his troops would declare him emperor, and he would move toward Rome or another administrative center. Simultaneously, in another region, a different army would support its own commander in the same manner. Internal conflicts became frequent while the empire's borders were left insufficiently protected. External incursions from neighboring groups, including increased activity from Germanic tribes and Persian forces, placed further strain on the empire's defenses, yet the legions were often engaged in internal disputes instead of frontier protection. One notable incident from 193 AD, predating the crisis, demonstrated the extent of military influence over imperial succession. Emperor Pertinax assumed the throne following the death of Emperor Commodus. Pertinax sought to restore discipline, implementing stricter regulations and reducing certain privileges for the Praetorian Guard, the elite unit responsible for protecting the emperor. This was met with opposition, and his tenure lasted only 86 days before members of the Guard removed him from office. Subsequently, the Praetorian Guard offered imperial authority to the highest financial contributor. From the walls of their encampment, they received bids from interested candidates. Two individuals competed for the position, with Didius Julianus, a senator of significant wealth, pledging a considerable financial reward to each guardsman, surpassing the offer of his rival. The Guard accepted this pledge, and Julianus was escorted to the palace and acknowledged as emperor. His rule, however, endured for only 66 days before another military leader, Septimius Severus, advanced on Rome, removed him from office, and disbanded the Guard. Over time, rulers became increasingly dependent on providing substantial payments to retain the army's support. To meet these financial obligations, they reduced the precious metal content of coinage, substituting gold and silver with less valuable metals, and increased the money supply, leading to currency devaluation. The resulting inflation placed economic pressure on the general population, particularly in the provinces. Nevertheless, sustaining the loyalty of the legions remained a priority, as the political consequences of losing it were significant. Manpower shortages only worsened the problem. Rome's population was not infinite, and decades of war had drained it. The solution seemed simple: hire outsiders. The empire began recruiting large numbers of barbarian auxiliaries, soldiers from tribes beyond the frontiers, Germans, Sarmatians, Moors, and others. Many fought well, serving loyally alongside Roman legions. Some became decorated commanders. But others had no deep loyalty to Rome. They fought for pay, and when the pay stopped or a better offer appeared, they could switch sides without hesitation. In some cases, entire units defected to the enemy, taking with them their Roman weapons, armor, and military knowledge. The growing influence of these non-Roman troops brought its own scandals. In 350 AD, the Frankish general Silvanus, serving in Gaul, declared himself emperor after suspecting that political rivals in the court had turned the emperor against him. His rebellion was short-lived, crushed by imperial forces, but it was another sign of a dangerous trend. Powerful military leaders with foreign roots and personal armies could challenge the emperor himself. By now, the army's role in politics was undeniable. It was the kingmaker, the final judge of who could sit on the throne. This was no longer the disciplined force of the early empire, guided by law and tradition. It was a political weapon, wielded by those with the resources to buy its favor. The legions could crown you emperor in the morning and murder you by nightfall. Worse still, while the army was consumed with its own internal power games, Rome's borders became increasingly porous. Germanic tribes crossed the Rhine and Danube. Sassanid Persia pressed in from the east. Pirates raided the Mediterranean. And when the legions did march to meet these threats, they sometimes returned with more grievances about pay and supplies than tales of victory. By the late empire, emperors who came to power through military support were often immediately forced to campaign not against Rome's enemies, but against their own rivals, proclaimed by other legions elsewhere. The empire became a patchwork of competing armies, each with its own ambitions. The Roman army had once been the steel backbone of the empire. Now it was both sword and dagger, defending Rome from its enemies while stabbing at its heart. And as the army's loyalty became something that could be bought and sold, the empire's stability became just as fragile as the gold in the imperial treasury. Yet while the emperor wrestled with the treachery of his soldiers, another cancer was spreading, this one far from the marble streets of Rome. Out in the provinces, in the fertile fields and bustling cities that fed and financed the empire, the governors, Rome's trusted administrators, were turning their backs on the state. They were building private kingdoms of greed, corruption, and betrayal. And when the provinces began to slip away, the empire itself would follow. The strength of Rome did not rest solely within the city itself. Rome functioned as a symbol, a capital, but the essential resources of the empire were drawn from far beyond the marble forums and densely populated streets of the Eternal City. From the olive groves of Hispania to the wheat fields of Egypt, From the silver mines of Dacia to the ports of Asia Minor, the provinces sustained Rome. They provided revenue, filled grain reserves, and supplied the materials that maintained the empire's infrastructure and governance. Without these contributions, Rome's central authority would have been severely diminished. In the earlier centuries, the provinces were connected to Rome not only through legal systems and taxation, but also through a sense of shared identity. Membership in the Roman world brought protection, political stability, and access to a vast trade network extending across 3 continents. Roman governors were expected to serve as stewards of this arrangement, administering justice and overseeing fair taxation. Over time, however, some provincial administrators began to deviate from these responsibilities, using their positions for personal advantage. By the 3rd and 4th centuries, maladministration in the provinces had become increasingly common. Governors and tax officials were frequently appointed on the basis of political affiliation or their capacity to generate substantial revenue for the imperial treasury rather than on administrative skill. This fostered a system in which financial extraction often outweighed equitable governance. Tax levels were sometimes set according to the maximum that could be obtained without inciting significant unrest. In certain cases, officials requested additional payments to process legal matters, while in others, property was appropriated and transferred to favored associates or sold privately. For local populations, these practices had direct economic consequences. Egyptian wheat, traditionally supplied at regulated prices to feed the urban population of Rome, was sometimes withheld until market shortages elevated prices. In Gaul, vineyards were taken over by local authorities, with the proceeds directed toward private estates in Italy, while local residents experienced reduced access to essential goods. Such developments eroded the sense of mutual benefit between Rome and its provinces. Where the imperial system had once been viewed as a guarantor of security and prosperity, it increasingly came to be perceived as a mechanism for the extraction of local resources. The political dynamic shifted further when provincial administrators began to assume direct military control. Traditionally, governors relied on legions stationed within or near their provinces, which remained under the authority of the emperor. During the crisis of the 3rd century, however, with multiple individuals claiming the imperial title and armies divided in their loyalties, some governors organized independent military forces. Initially, this was presented as a measure to address frontier threats during periods when the imperial army was occupied with internal conflicts. Over time, such forces were occasionally employed to advance individual political ambitions. A significant example occurred in 260 AD. Following the capture of Emperor Valerian by the Persian ruler Shapur I, the western provinces of Gaul, Hispania, and Britannia formed an autonomous political entity under the leadership of Postumus, later referred to by historians as the Gallic Empire. This state, which existed for nearly 15 years, issued its own coinage, maintained its own legions, and managed its own borders, often with notable efficiency. While Postumus formally expressed allegiance to Roman traditions, the practical reality was the fragmentation of central authority. In the eastern regions, similar patterns emerged. In Palmyra, Queen Zenobia rose to prominence during a period of heightened pressure along the eastern frontier. Initially aligned with Rome's interests, she expanded her authority over Egypt and parts of Asia Minor, effectively creating a distinct eastern dominion. Her administration in Palmyra equaled Rome in cultural and economic stature, and her challenge to imperial authority persisted until Emperor Aurelian personally led a campaign to restore central control in 272 AD. Even after such regional powers were reabsorbed, the precedent had been set. Provinces could operate independently and still maintain stability and prosperity. In some territories, irregularities in tax collection reached notable levels. In North Africa, certain governors collected amounts exceeding official quotas, retaining the surplus for personal use. Petitions to the central administration often received no response, partly because higher-ranking officials were sometimes connected to the same practices. This created a systemic pattern of revenue diversion, in which multiple levels of the imperial administration benefited from excess collections. Meanwhile, the economy of the provinces suffered. Farmers abandoned their land rather than face crushing tax burdens. Trade routes decayed as roads and ports went unrepaired. The funds for their upkeep siphoned off into private coffers. Local industries, pottery in Gaul, textiles in Egypt, mining in the Balkans declined as oppressive taxation left little profit for reinvestment. This economic rot had a political consequence. When barbarian tribes began to push into imperial territory in the 4th and 5th centuries, some provincial populations welcomed them rather than resist. To these people, the barbarians represented a change from the crushing demands of Roman tax collectors. In some cases, they even negotiated with invaders, offering supplies and passage in exchange for protection from Rome's own administrators. By the final centuries, Rome's hold on the provinces was like a hand gripping water. The tighter it tried to squeeze, the more slipped through its fingers. When the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, the city's symbolic power was shattered. But in truth, the empire had been hollowed out long before. Its provinces, the true engine of its strength, had been alienated, exploited, and in some cases, completely lost. The Roman Empire was not destroyed by a single event, nor by a single enemy. It was undone piece by piece, scandal by scandal, betrayal by betrayal. From the palace intrigues of emperors to the corruption of the army, from the greed of governors to the rebellion of provinces, the empire's downfall was not a sudden collapse, but a long, slow unraveling. And perhaps that is the greatest scandal of all, that the empire which had conquered the world could not save itself from the rot within. The rise and fall of Rome is not just ancient history. It's a warning. Power can be won, but it can also be squandered. Corruption, greed, and betrayal have toppled empires before, and they can do so again. If you want to uncover more untold stories from the shadows of history, the scandals, the conspiracies, the moments when the fate of nations hung by a thread, then make sure you subscribe. Share this with those who think history is just the past, and join me as we explore the truths most would rather forget. Because the past is never really gone, it's just waiting to repeat itself.